Sorry, guys. Hopefully third time's the charm. I don't know what's going on. My IT husband seems to think that the computer got overheated and that's why it keeps shutting down. So I don't know. He did some things, he moved some stuff, he like plugged in something. I don't know. I was not happy. I will tell you that. I was very frustrated at this point. So this is the third attempt at chapter 6, public opinion. So this is part 3, hopefully the last one. I know I said that last time, but hopefully it'll work this time. So let me pull back up the PowerPoint and we will get that moving. Gracious me. And of course, now I've got to find where we were because of course I do. All right, let me see. Okay, so get back to where we were. Okay, so here's where we were. Social networks. We are on page 157, 158-ish. So we talked about our peers, and I was in the middle of talking about social media and all of the different types of outlets. So that is sort of like a new form of like peer influence because you're on those social media outlets with your family and your friends and your coworkers and just like the people in your life. So you're seeing you're basically seeing kind of a lot of unfiltered thoughts from them because that's what social media is and does, right? Like we're all keyboard warriors and just sort of word vomiting our stuff out there into the universe via social media. So we're definitely inundated with people's thoughts and feelings as big events occur. And kind of the only way to avoid that is if you just don't get on the internet, right? So social networks definitely have a part to play in how you shape your public opinions. So this photo says the family is one of the largest influences on a person's political views. Children raised in conservative or liberal families usually, but not always, hold those same views later in life, which we were talking about before. So now we're going to talk about education. So education definitely impacts your public opinion and your values and your beliefs. And sometimes it shifts you away from, like maybe your upbringing or whatever, because you guys are, anybody who has higher levels of education is exposed to more information than people who just go to high school and then they're done. There's more in-depth learning that happens at the college level. You're exposed to other cultures, you're exposed to other beliefs in a way that when you're in grade school, one, not as many people are talking about it around you, right, outside of your family. And two, you're more likely to be exposed to people of like a similar thought because you're all from the same end of town. So generally the same sort of income median and the same sort of like background, whether or not your parents were educated, etc. When you go to college, you're exposed to people all on the spectrum, people who were raised with money, people who were dirt poor, people who like, it's definitely a wide array of people that you meet and get to know that you might not have had an opportunity in another manner. So Americans definitely acquire beliefs in liberty, equality, and democracy based on their level of education and the different types of education they receive. So you're definitely going to hear differing political opinions in a way that you might not have before. And then the more educated someone is, generally speaking, the more likely they are to be politically engaged. Now, that's not always the case, but generally they're just more in touch with kind of what's happening around them from the way that they're taught to think sort of outside of the box in college. You're more likely to kind of pay attention to what's happening to you and what's happening in the world around you, because you learn to do that in college in a way that you're not, you're still sort of like insulated when you're in high school and all of that. So, so college kind of opens the doors to kind of view the world in different ways. You also have more higher earning potential. It's not always how it works out, right? Like an English lit major may not make as much as like a civil engineer, but you are more likely to be higher educated and be higher on the rung for the career ladder. And that exposes you to other factors as well that end up influencing your political beliefs. And your earning income potential also affects your political beliefs, which we'll talk about in just a minute. So if you go to page 158, 159, you'll see the who participates that's on the screen right now. It says if you turn on the TV or look at your social media feed, you might feel that everyone is expressing political opinions on almost a constant basis. I think we can all agree to that. Who expresses their opinions most often and how do they do it? So this kind of breaks that down. So by political party, so Republicans are here 52, I think it's by percent, yeah, percentage of US adults who say they express opinions about politics by discussing politics and government with others a few times a week or more. So 52% of Republicans, 45% who say that they are moderate to leaning conservative, but not necessarily Republican in nature. 45% Democratic, lean Democrat, 53, moderate to lean liberal, 37%. So if you notice, people who feel like, okay, like I am secure enough in my political beliefs that I want to own a political party and I want to be a part of a political party, they're more likely to voice their opinions than people who do not belong to a particular political party. The more educated someone is, the more likely they are to voice their opinions, because generally speaking, they are more knowledgeable about a variety of subjects than someone with like a high school diploma would be. So high school or less, 44%, some college, 51%, college graduate, 56%, postgraduate, which would be myself, someone with a master's degree or a law degree, or and then if you go up further, a doctorate and that kind of thing, 66%. And I would venture to say that that's true. Like, I mean, I do have people who in my life who are like in these areas, and they definitely voice their opinions. And we in the South tend to be a mouthy bunch, right? Like we all got something to say about something. But I definitely feel like there are a lot more thoughtful responses, a lot more thoughtful posts, in-depth thinking, news articles that are more in-depth and more impartial are posted by people with college degrees for sure. How do Americans express their political opinions? This is the percentage of US adults who say they've done the following activities on social media in the last year. And this was done in 2019. So by party, the orange is Republican, the blue is Democrat. So encourage others to take actions on issues important to them, because people get like fired up and they're like, you need to be fired up too. Taken part in a group that shares an interest in an issue or cause. Looked for information about rallies and protests. Less people are interested in doing that because it's really easy to be a keyboard warrior. It's really hard to put your face out there because people can be really nasty to people who are out there like doing the thing, right? Like being in a rally or being in a protest. People can get really rude about it. And so people get concerned about kind of putting their face out there in that respect. Here, change their profile to show support for a cause. So like, Facebook is really good about that. And I think Instagram has a little bit of it, but Facebook is really big about like the profile, like icons and stuff, like, oh, make sure you register to vote, or, oh, you're pro-choice, or you're pro-life, or you're, like protect the environment, or, like, Second Amendment supporter, or like whatever, right? Like, they've got those like little round things that kind of go around your profile, and then it lets people know like, this is where I stand on different issues. But it's a pretty low number, which is interesting because I see a lot of people on my Facebook page who utilize that. So like my numbers, I feel like would be higher than this. So it may just be the type of people that are on my page. I've got a lot of family, and I've got a lot of friends from like high school and stuff on my page because I'm on our reunion committee. So like I have everybody and their brother on my page, but I also have a ton of people on my page from political campaigns I've worked on and from college. And so those people are more likely to be vocal and to be engaged. So I see much more of this than I guess everybody else does. And then the last one, posted hashtag related to political or social issue, like hashtag save the whales, right? Like, so it depends on what it is. Like a lot of people are willing to say, hey, you should get involved. Here's what I care about and here's why. And maybe even reach out to like a group that also shares that. So you have that camaraderie. And then the other things kind of, fall lower on the list. And then the last one, percentage of US adults who say they have done each of the following in the last year: by education, high school or less, some college, college graduate, postgraduate, publicly express support for a political campaign on social media. So people with some college and postgraduate degrees are more likely to do that, with college graduate just being slightly under that. Contacted an elected official. This is a big difference. People who are postgraduate degrees are more likely to be reaching out and saying, do you know who I am? You need to better recognize, right? And then attended a political rally. Those numbers are very low for the reasons I'd mentioned before, but postgraduate degree is more likely because they're, again, more likely to be engaged in politics in general. Let's see, should all of those. And again, that's on page 159 if you want to take a look at that. So not just like the people around you influence your public opinion, but like who you are, what makes you up, right? So like your education, that's a part of who you are. Your race, your ethnicity, your religion, all of those things are inherently part of the puzzle that makes you, right? So your book first mentions race. So you're more likely to focus on issues that affect, like the Black community, for example, with the Black Lives Matter movement, with some of the police brutality issues before, with segregation, and then before that, slavery and the right to vote, and all of those things, right? Those are shared common experiences as a group, right? Like that particular group of people who identify as Black or African American are going to share in that like commonality for their group identity. And so that definitely has relevance for how you view public opinions, because based on what's happened to you will also determine how you feel the government should act about certain things and how they should treat their constituents. So when you poll Black versus white, for example, you're going to have different percentage of numbers based on their personal experiences as to whether or not they see the system as fair, the justice system, the political system, voting, housing, job opportunity, education, all of those things, for the reasons that I mentioned in the civil liberties and civil rights lectures, where like white experiences were much more favorable, obviously, than the Black experience. And so people who have been subjected to those discriminations are not going to have the same level of trust in the system that somebody who didn't experience that. For example, I have a friend who I met in college, and she and I were talking. She's Black, and you know, obviously, like, I'm pretty, you know, pasty skinned. So I have obviously not personally experienced those situations. And so she's always telling me about different examples of things that either she's experienced or people she knows has experienced. One of the things she told me was that when she was in high school, she was driving her parents' car. It was a really nice car. Both of her parents have um, postgraduate degrees. They are both educators in the big district schools, and they had a nicer vehicle, and she was driving it with like a friend or something, and she got pulled over. And the cops started questioning her on why she was in such a nice car. There's no way that that would have ever happened if I had been driving that vehicle. Like, it wouldn't have even crossed the mind of a police official to do that. Now, I didn't grow up with money, so we didn't have a nice car. That was not like an issue. I mean, we had cars that worked, right? Like, I mean, we didn't have like a jalopy, but man, I just sounded like 80 years old by saying jalopy. But you know, we just had like basic cars, you know, like my dad had a pickup truck with like an old camper shells, like a 1980s vehicle. And my mom had like a Ford Taurus. So like, it wasn't like I was, you know, like they didn't have Cadillacs or BMWs or Jags or whatever, right? Whatever you consider to be nice. But I can't fathom that even if I had a nice car to drive, that I would ever be pulled over. And they basically questioned her as if they were accusing her of stealing the vehicle. And so she had to show proof, like, listen, like, see my ID, here's the insurance information, this is my parents' vehicle. And they were very suspicious of her. And all she was doing was driving. She wasn't speeding, she wasn't being reckless. It was solely because she was driving while Black, which blew my mind when she told me that, because I could not imagine that happening. And then you know, years later, I'm teaching this class, and I actually had a student who was Latina, and she was driving down Highway 231, for those of you who are in Panama City and you're familiar with the area. And she was speeding a little bit, as a lot of people do on 231, right? Like on that big strip, you know, like where the jail and all that is, like people go 65 in the 55, like that's not uncommon, right? And other people were driving faster than her, but she got pulled over. And instead of like being given a ticket and being allowed to leave, which is what happens when you speed, speaking from experience, when I was in high school and for more years than I care to count, I had a lead foot. I was in several car accidents as a result of the fact that I'm a habitually late individual by nature. It's definitely not a positive like character trait. Like, I'm better about it now because I have a child and I'm older, and like ain't nobody got time to be paying tickets and all that mess, right? But by nature, I'm a huge procrastinator. Therefore, I tend to be late to a lot of things if I don't override that character flaw. And so I've gotten, I couldn't even tell you, I'd have to sit down and count how many speeding tickets. And I've been in half a dozen or more car accidents, and almost every single one of them were absolutely my fault, because I wasn't paying attention, because I was being reckless. There were accidents that I never even received tickets for. And then there were some that I got tickets for, you know, got tickets for speeding once or twice, got like let off with a warning. This girl a woman, ended up being arrested, and she was going like 5 or 10 over the speed limit, and they kept her overnight. And so she actually missed class, and then had a couple of different situations where like she had to go to court over it and fight the ticket. And her husband worked in Tallahassee and was actually like a lobbyist. And so like he wasn't like just right here available to be able to like come and bail her out right away. And I know how this local police system works because I have been in a number of stupid situations of my own making, and never once was there ever even a question of, I think I need to take you to jail because you were being reckless. When I have like rear-ended people before in my younger years, which is not something I'm proud of, but she was going 10 miles over the speed limit and she got arrested for it. So that's definitely something that, you know, shows the difference between the sort of, and all this was happening when a lot of cases were starting to come out where the Hispanic community was being targeted a lot, especially like out west in New Mexico and stuff, and where the police were targeting them in a way that they hadn't been doing. So that was just, you know, a cluster. So those sort of shared experiences where you can, you know, you can fill a room full of Black people and they all have similar stories of, oh yeah, I got pulled over for that. Oh, same in the town too. Or, oh yeah, I definitely got like side-eyed because I didn't have like my hair like heat trained and I had it natural. And like, I definitely like got attitude from this job because of, you know, such and such. And they all have like similar stories over and over and over and over and over again. And if you're listening to this going, I don't know anybody that's ever happened to you, sit down and have some conversations with some people. Google is your friend too. But I will say that not everybody is comfortable with basically teaching people who haven't experienced that what they go through on a regular basis, because it gets tiring. Like I can only imagine how exhausting it is to be like the token Black friend and to be asked questions of like, so what happens with this? And like, how have you experienced this situation? Just Google it. There'll be news story after news story after news story. There'll be blogs out there. There are story after story of negative situations happening that are very similar across the board without alienating the Black people in your life. So unless like they have expressed that they are comfortable, then like don't hound them about their Blackness. Okay. So that definitely happens to different minorities, just like it happens to, like, there are differences in gender, which we'll talk about in a minute. And those are also shared experiences. So there's definitely like a link that happens among ethnicities of those sort of shared experiences. And it definitely impacts them as a whole as to who they would support as a candidate, what sort of groups they support, what sort of issues matter to them. And it's not necessarily all of them, right? I just started working at the supervisor of elections office, and I was young and just getting involved in politics and government. And I had a Black couple come in. The husband was military, the wife was not, and they had just gotten stationed there. So they were updating their voter registration. And you get in the habit pretty quickly, if you do voter registrations for people, to kind of watch as they're filling out the form to make sure they don't miss anything. Oh, you missed that checkbox. Oh, don't forget to put your birthday, or do you have an old address you need to list? Those sort of things. So it kind of saves time, especially as it gets busier, more and more people are coming in to do that. So I'm watching the wife fill hers out. I'm watching the husband fill his out, and she finishes hers first. And, you know, I'm double checking, making sure it's good. And then as he's getting to the bottom of his, he marks his political party. His wife and him do not have the same political party. His wife was registered as a Democrat and he was registering as a Republican. Being very new to politics, I did not realize at the time that as a generalization, more Black people register and vote Democrat than not. but more military members tend to be more conservative in their viewpoints. So it all kind of depends on what, like your overall, right, as to kind of which way they go. And so I made the mistake of saying, oh, no, I'm sorry, this box is for Democrat and this one's for Republican. Y'all, he looked at me and he said, I know I'm registering Republican. And I was like, oh my God, I'm so sorry. I did not mean, like, I did not mean to put you in a box. I apologize. And his wife kind of like cleared the air and was like, girl, it's okay. I've been telling him for years he's registering wrong. But that is not okay, obviously, to do. But it also taught me a huge lesson on like not making assumptions, because even though, okay, like you check these boxes of, well, okay, I'm Black, I'm military, I'm a female, I'm what, you know, like, and based on the check boxes, you go over to the Democrat line or the Republican line, and it's not that clear cut, because it also depends on other factors and your personal life experiences. And so that does vary from person to person. And so of course I felt like a right arse, and was very afraid I was going to lose my job that I had not had very long. And it was my first job that wasn't like, you know, retail, right? Like, or, you know, that type of like service work. Like it was kind of like my first like grown-up job. And so I was very afraid I was going to lose my job. But the guy was like, it's fine. It happens. I've had other people do that before too. So, and that also showed me in that moment, because I always assumed, because I was raised up in a family where like my parents and both sets of grandparents were all the same political party. And so I just kind of always assumed that that was always like an issue important enough that that would be a determining factor as to whether or not you choose to marry someone. And boy, howdy, am I wrong about that. I have met a multitude of couples who go complete opposite directions. How that doesn't end in divorce is beyond me. Somebody has to not be as into it as the other person, I feel like, because if there are like too many heated debates, I feel like that would not end well. Like my husband and I are very similar in our political viewpoints. And because this is what I do for a living and I'm so passionate about it, there'd be no way I could be with someone who was like complete, like I couldn't marry someone like my brother, because all we would do would be fighting about the fundamentals of literally everything. And so for me, I could not imagine that. And I've actually read stories where people have gotten divorces over, you know, like having such a vast difference in political views that they're like, I don't even know who you are anymore. And some people would find that dumb, but when you, like, if you're vehemently opposed to a candidate and you're like, they're going to ruin everything, like really, this person is dangerous. And the other person is like, I think they're our savior. Somebody has changed along the way and somebody changed up the rules, right? So, but that couple is a good example of how that's not always the case. But I give you that story to say, do not judge a book by its cover. Let somebody tell you their viewpoints. Do not just pigeonhole them because of their gender or their race or whatever, because you have no idea what the rest of their story is until they tell you, if they tell you. So that was definitely like a pie in the face sort of situation. I definitely felt like I had egg on my face. And it definitely taught me a very valuable lesson very early on in my involvement with voter registration and the political process. So your book has figure 6.3 on page 160, and it talks about perception of fair treatment across racial groups. So I touched on this a little bit earlier. This says percentage of whites and blacks saying blacks are treated less fairly than whites in each of the following situations. So blue is black respondents, red is white respondents. Criminal justice system, pretty large gap, right? 61% of whites say that Blacks are treated less fairly, where 87% of Blacks say the same. In dealing with the police, 84 and 63%. So again, that's pretty similar, right? In hiring, pay, and promotions, this is a vastly large gap. 82% of Blacks think that they are treated less fairly when it comes to jobs and pay and going up the career ladder, where only 44% of whites feel that way. So a lot of people do not talk about how much money they make. They especially don't talk about it with their coworkers. You know, I'm sure if you've ever had a job, you've probably been told, like, it's just better that you don't talk about it, right? I know most every job I've ever been at, it's like, do not talk about how much money you make. A lot of that is so it keeps the masses of the employees from revolting on the employer. So when somebody's like, wait a minute, I've been here like 5 years longer than you, I do more work, I've been trained in X, Y, and Z, but you're making more money than me, that's not right, right? So it's a much larger gap because a lot of people do not talk about how much money they make. And so it's hard when there's like a big gap because a lot of people aren't aware of it. It's very much like an us versus them mentality that employers pit their employees against each other, the haves versus the have-nots. And like, you don't need to worry about it. You just need to put your nose to the grindstone and do your job and you'll be taken care of. But if you don't look out for your own interests, you could very well easily get the shaft, because I've had enough jobs in my life that not all, and I would venture to say most employers do not have your best interest at heart. It's about the bottom line. It's about getting out the product or achieving the whatever. And a lot of employers, I can't say all employers, right? But a lot of employers, in my experience and other people I've spoken to, treat their employees, and here it's really bad, like they're a dime a dozen, like they're replaceable. But with this great, what they've been calling the great resignation, people are saying, you know what? It is not worth the poor treatment I'm getting to stay and do this job. I would rather go off and do my own thing. I'd rather go and find another job. You have no loyalty to me whatsoever. You don't really care about what happens to me. My paycheck reflects that. The way you treat me when I'm sick reflects that, or when my kid is sick or whatever. So peace out, right? Like, and so, but if they can keep employees from bonding and talking and comparing notes, it's easier to basically screw over their employees because they don't realize how bad they've got it until they start asking questions. So the next thing is when applying for a mortgage or any type of loan, like an auto loan, that's a huge difference too, 74% versus 38%. And remember, I talked before about all of the segregation and discrimination that was happening with the housing market and with lending practices and being able to open up bank accounts and that sort of thing when we were going through the civil rights movement and before. And some of that has still carried over to a certain extent, because again, remember what I talked about before, generationally, like if your parents weren't able to do very well because they were oppressed, now you've got a steeper hill to climb than your white counterpart on the other end of town who may not have had that struggle, right? Or whoever. So, so that disparity has definitely caused issues. So the next one, in stores and restaurants, 70% versus 37%. So they don't believe that they're treated the same when it comes to being served in a customer capacity. When seeking medical treatment, I mentioned this in one of the last lectures, 59% versus 26%. I mentioned I think it was Serena Williams, who almost died after she had her child because she was ignored when she was telling them that she was experiencing horrendous pain. And there have been a lot of examples of that where, the medical community had these terrible stigmas about Black people being able to tolerate pain better than other people and nonsense like that. And so yeah, there's definitely a less fair treatment in the medical community, but I don't think a lot of white people are aware of it. And that's with a lot of these things. Like, what if white people aren't talking to people about it, they're not researching it, they're not trying to be informed and enlightened, and they've just got their head in the sand, then they're not going to be aware of these issues. And then the last one, when voting in elections. So that shows you how the race who has dealt with it feels versus the people who haven't dealt with it. So that makes a very large difference in the perception of how people are being treated across the board. So the next one that it talks about is gender. So a lot of people try and say that gender doesn't matter, that a gender gap isn't a thing. And I'm not saying this because I'm a woman, I'm the fairer sex or any of that. I'm saying it because studies have shown that over and over and over again. Your book even says it. So like, I'm just teaching it right from the book. You would be amazed in all the years I've taught this, how many times, because it comes out of a woman's mouth, I always have at least one male push back, and sometimes like very insistently, about gender gap issues in our society. And it takes all I have to be professional about it, to be frank, because I'm not teaching you guys anything that isn't like backed up, right? So as the slide says, and as your book says, a gender gap absolutely 1000% exists. So the definition of a gender gap is a distinctive pattern of voting behavior reflecting the differences in views between women and men. Your book gives specific examples of that. And I'm not going to like read every little thing, but for example, women are more likely to oppose military intervention and support gun control than men. That's like every time they're surveyed, like that shows up over and over and over again. And let's see, perhaps because of these differences, women are more likely than men to vote for Democratic candidates in 2020 presidential election. Men were more likely to favor Republican Donald Trump, and women to favor Democrat Joe Biden. The tendency of voting gaps between men and women is known as the gender gap. Majority of Americans believe the US hadn't gone far enough when it comes to giving women equal rights. However, there's a significant difference by who is asked that question. 64% of women agreed with the statement, while only 49% of men. Same situation we just saw with Black versus white, right? Women are the ones experiencing the oppression, not the men. So women are going to be the ones to understand it a little better than a male would. Women are more likely than men to believe there are major obstacles to gender equality, specifically in positions of political power. And I discussed this in either the last lecture or the one before about reasons why women have a harder time breaking into politics and getting elected to office. So I won't go over all that again. Please go back and watch the previous lectures if you're not sure of what I'm referencing to, but there are definitely large gaps that occur because equality is still very much a struggle for women. So please definitely go back and watch that if you have no idea what I'm talking about. So another thing that determines what direction you sort of take your public opinion is religion, which I touched on a little bit earlier. So, for example, white evangelical Protestants and weekly churchgoers are more likely to hold conservative views. Those without religious affiliation are more likely to hold liberal views. So for people who consider themselves to be very religious, that is usually their number one priority, and they tend to put that as their first and primary focus above all else, above their experiences, above their peers, but whatever, like what the church says goes, right? And of course, now that depends on the church you go to as well. I mean, not all religious individuals register Republican. There are a lot of like Southern churches who, it's a predominantly like Black congregation. A lot of them are more likely to be registered as a Democrat because of their other life experiences. So it really is dependent on individual to individual. And of course, all of these are generalizations based on the majority of what happens, but that is not the entirety of population, obviously, but this is like the general rule. Of course, there are always outliers. So there's that. There's not really much more to say. That's pretty, straightforward. So the next thing that can impact your public opinion and values and beliefs are your party affiliation, right? Like, but all of these things prior and the economic class lend itself to what political party you tend to choose, right? The one that kind of encompasses the political values and beliefs you put together based on all of these other things we've talked about. So party affiliation is one of the most important factors that affect your attitude. For me, it's kind of like what came first, the chicken or the egg, right? Did your party affiliation come first, or did your political attitude come first? And that's how you chose your political party. So we talked about this too. We don't have as much of a middle ground. Republicans are increasingly conservative. Democrats are increasingly liberal. Self-identified partisans tend to rely on party leaders and the media to take appropriate positions on major issues. So it all depends on already how you're feeling, right? Like, you don't register Republican if you're, I don't know, like if you hit a lot of the other sort of check boxes, right? If you are for larger government, more social programs, if you're not religious, if you are a minority, if you're a woman, if you're more likely to choose to be Democrat. You're not, I choose to be Democrat. And then, oh yeah, these other things fall into place. It's usually these things cause me to choose to be a Democrat, or vice versa, to choose to be a Republican. So, and then the last agent of socialization that your book talks about is your economic class. So money makes a massive difference in what your political leaning ends up being, what your values are, because everybody experiences money differently and determines what you find important and what you think the government should therefore find important. So group differences exist along class and wealth dimensions, with the wealthy and the poor having different opinions on inequality and other economic issues. So the book used to have like a chart that showed, based on your money situation, but I don't see it. It might be in another chapter, maybe. We'll see. But that's okay. So that talks about all the agents of socialization. So now we're going to talk about political leaders and how they can influence your public opinion as well. So the beginnings of this is like, how do you choose liberal or conservative, Democrat or Republican? How do you decide on your values and beliefs, right? Like, what makes up the core of you? What puzzle pieces make up you? And then the next section that your book talks about is how political leaders take particular action that help guide the public in the way that they want them to go. Okay. So photographed here is on the left is FDR. Okay. So presidents have used a variety of methods over the years to help shape public opinion in support of their policies. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt held fireside chats, also known as radio broadcasts, that highlighted his policy goals. President Trump frequently tweeted about policies and other politicians to also connect with citizens. So it's sort of his own modern day situation. So FDR would discuss like issues that are coming up, things that matter, and try to like get down on like the general public's level and say, listen, these are the things that are coming up. You know, this is what I think we should do. This is what my colleagues think we should do. This is what the opposition thinks we should do. And just like a constant communication to the public. And it made the citizens feel like FDR was more accessible. And he was excellent about like connecting to the people in that way. We'll talk more about that later when we talk about the presidency. We'll also talk about during campaigns ways that political leaders, specifically presidents, have tried to make themselves personable in a way that people would connect to vote for them. So, and then the tweet talks, let's see, Trump said, I am substantially lowering Medicare premiums, have instituted favored nations clause and rebates on drug companies. Never been done before. Drug companies are hitting me with fake ads, just like Sleepy Joe. Be careful, drug prices will be reduced massively and soon. So that's what he said. That whether that happened or not, that's another topic for another day as to the details on all of that. But your book discusses, they gave other examples too, like George Bush developed an extensive public relations program to bolster popular support for the president's policy, including the war on terrorism. Barack Obama was the first to use digital and social media to promote the president's policy agenda, especially in national healthcare reform. Facebook posts served to personalize the president, and Obama was especially adept at using Twitter with 70 million followers on that network. And then it goes to talk about how Donald Trump also did the same thing with social media interaction. So let's see. Oh, and back on the economic class, your book gives some specific examples, percentages, that kind of thing, and different issues that people care about based on their age. And we'll be talking about that in more detail when we are talking about voting in future chapters. So, let's see, already talked about all that. All right. Political knowledge. Now, I already hit on this quite a bit in chapter 1. So chapter 1 talks about political knowledge a lot, right? If you guys recall. So without political knowledge, you going into the polls is just a shot in the dark, right? Like, because you don't really know what it is that you're going into, right? You haven't done your homework. That's like taking one of our tests and Christmas treeing it because you didn't do the reading, you didn't watch my lectures, you didn't do the quizzes, you just were like, oh yeah, I got a test, I should probably attempt to pass that. So, let's see. Oh, this also puts us at our next chapter goal. Woo-hoo. Which is the explain how Americans' level of political knowledge affects public opinion and democracy. Now, I talked about this a lot already in some of the other chapters, right? Like the less you know, the less you can participate, which is why it's so vital for you to do your homework, for you to understand what's out there, to understand what the political leaders and candidates and elected officials are talking about. Otherwise, you can't do your part as a citizen. So knowledgeable citizens are better able to evaluate information and determine whether it's relevant to and consistent with their own beliefs and opinions. The average American doesn't have a lot of formal knowledge on policy debates or political institutions, processes, or its leaders, which is why you guys are here, right? To try and bridge that gap a little bit. Because being informed politically requires time and energy. I talked to you guys about that too. People don't want to take the time to do that. Like they get caught up in their own day-to-day stuff. Like, I don't have time to do all the research on all of this, or I'm a single mom or whatever, or, like I'm working 2 jobs or, like whatever. So a lot of people rely on shortcuts, skim newspaper headings and the little captions, not read the whole thing. I've been guilty of that too. Relying on people that you trust and what their opinions are instead. the media, their family, their friends, social media, interest groups, all that kind of stuff. So that causes a lot of misinformation, which can distort what your public opinion becomes because you did not do your homework. It's really that simple. That's like, oh, you know what? I've got 2 hours before my exam. I don't have time to read all the chapters. Let me just skim through because I screwed around. I didn't do it early. And then you're like, oh, like I was not prepared for this. And so I don't know what all the information is because I didn't take the time to do it. It's the same way. Like you get back what you put out. And so if you don't take time to be knowledgeable, then you're not going to be a good citizen. You're not going to practice good citizenship. And so you're not going to be able to be an informed voter like you need to be. So doing so doesn't just impact you, it impacts the entire system, entire system and our society. It weakens our American democracy because a lot of people, like I mentioned in the previous lectures, still want to go to the polls and feel like they're participating, but they didn't do the work to participate properly. And so that can negatively impact who gets elected because they're just Christmas treeing it or whatever, or they don't go at all. And so then it's chosen by a very small select group of people. And so it isn't truly representative of what the entire community wants. So you can't really defend your own political interest, rights, and freedoms. You can't push back when somebody is trying to take away your civil liberties and civil rights because you don't know what they are and you don't know how it impacts you and you don't really know how to say this is wrong and here's why it's wrong and I'm not going to allow it because you don't know, because you don't have the information at your disposal. Politically ignorant individuals are more easily influenced by political elites, skewed media, and special interests because they don't know any better. So they take things at face value instead of kind of picking it apart and making sure that what they're being told is true. And that also causes political and economic inequality because the people who do know and have a vested interest in it are going to vote for their own personal interests. But if nobody like you is showing up to the polls to vote for your interests, you're out of luck. And now you've got to go within the system that isn't really representative of you. So the government does pay attention to data and to polls that come back on what people want, what the voters are saying at the polls. They're very, very responsive to public opinion, but that's a two-way street. So government policies are influenced by public opinion, but they can also shape public opinion. So public opinion and policy don't always match up, right? Like we've seen that before. I mean, look at what just happened with the Supreme Court, right? They struck down Roe v. Wade, but the majority of people who have been polled about Roe v. Wade is supportive of the right to privacy and abortion rights for women. So the majority of the country disagrees with what the Supreme Court just did, and for overreach restrictions. So that's an example of like policy and public opinion not lining up. When elected officials focus on policies that don't really line up with public opinion, it's usually because they view certain groups of the electorate as more important than others. We have a conservative leaning court. They made a decision conservatively, which is the conservative base who elected the president who put them into office agree with that decision. So that is what impacted that, right? Like, you know, one led to the other, led to the other. So conservatives supported a conservative president placed conservative Supreme Court justices. Supreme Court justices made a conservative decision that the conservative constituents would be happy with. So more affluent and educated citizens outsized influence in policy, usually because they vote more often and because they also donate more money, because money talks. And remember, we talked about that when we were talking about like freedom of speech, and that money facilitates free speech. Therefore, that's why we have campaign donations. So people who are more engaged are voting. So that's a form of having their voice heard. They're donating, another form of having their voice heard. They're out there on social media and participating in their political parties and interest groups. And so they are engaged in all the different ways. They're contacting their elected officials. They are out there doing the work to make sure that what they care about is in front of people. So here's a little cartoon for you, which is on your page 167, which means we are also getting really close to the end of this lecture. Yay, third time's the charm. I don't want to jinx it, but so far, I think my husband finally fixed it after I asked him to the first time. So what are you gonna do? You know, it is what it is. You guys just get 3 little sections. So let's see, this is obviously Calvin and Hobbes, 1994. So this is an old one. Here's the latest poll of your performance as dad. Your approval rating is pretty low, I'm afraid. That's because there's not necessarily any connection between what's good and what's popular. I do what's right, not what gets approval. You'll never keep the job with that attitude. If someone else offers to do it, let me know. And that is a really good example also of politics and government, right? A lot of people don't want that job. How many times do you hear people saying, who, I wouldn't want that job, man? I tell you what, like, I don't envy you for having to do that and deal with all the people. And so that's kind of what it boils down to, right? Like politicians, elected officials are trying, if they're not completely crooked and just in it for the money and what lines their pockets, are trying to do what they think is right for their constituents, and hopefully it lines up with their constituents' values and what their constituents want. But sometimes they break away from what they want if they say they don't really have all the information, this is really what's right, and I just hope that they trust me enough for that. And we'll talk about that when we get further down the line between like a trustee, elected official, and the other, which the word is completely eluding me right now, but we'll discuss that in more detail in one of our future chapters. So, you know, I mentioned opinion polls before. So that is a large way in which our government can test the waters and see where people, I'm making the smudge worse, see where the public and their constituents stand on a particular issue and help them to build policy based on that. So, so there are a lot of public opinion polls. Some of you may have received them, you've gotten phone calls for them, or emails or texts if you're on different lists and stuff, to try and figure out where people stand. So, so this section is the explain the relationship between public opinion and government policy. So that is the 4th chapter goal. So let's see, public opinion polls are scientific instruments for measuring public opinion, right? So they take a sample of the population of the people who their focus is on, whether it's all citizens, whether it's they're trying to find out, like, you know, what seniors think because they're looking at making changes to Medicare and Social Security or something, right? So, so they take a sample of those people. A sample is a small group selected by researchers to represent the most important characteristics of an entire population. Because obviously, like, they don't have time or the resources to be able to contact every single person who's on Medicare, but they can take an appropriate sample size if they're trying to, you know, make some sort of change to it. Like, they can say, okay, we need to reach out to this many percentage of men and women and of this color and that color and whatever. One way to obtain an appropriate sample is through what's called a simple random sample, which is a method used by pollsters to select a representative sample in which every individual in the population has an equal probability of being selected as a respondent. So that's one option. That's one method for getting a sample. Another option is random digit dialing, which is a polling method where respondents are selected at random from a list of 10-digit telephone numbers, with every effort made to avoid bias in the construction of the sample. So like a simple random sample would maybe apply to like Medicare and Social Security recipients, because why would you call me asking how it would change like my health insurance if I'm not on Medicare, right? Or you know, like they would reach out to people of a certain age and like people on disability, and so they would take all those people and, you know, name out of the hat type thing would be the simple random. And then if they're, gosh, I'm trying to think of another good example. All I can think about is pizza. Like this has nothing to do with politics, but say Pizza Hut is doing a national survey to find out what everybody's favorite topping is on pizza. They would maybe do the random digit dialing because it's most likely that whoever answers eats some kind of pizza, right? So that's the difference. So they have to get a large enough sample size to be a good representation, which is usually around 1,000 if it's a randomly selected people to get a really good sample. You can get like a good, you can get good stats from that. So let's see. And then they always have to account, they have to have enough people to lessen their margin of error. So, and if they don't do that, then they have what's known as the sampling error, which is a polling error that arises based on the small size of a sample. So if the sample size is too small, if they don't have enough people, then there's a margin of error because they haven't gotten enough voices to really build like good numbers to see the wide array of opinions out there, right? Like if you only ask like 50 people, you're not going to get a good representation of what it is that you're trying to ask versus 1,000. So there are good ways to put together a survey and there are bad ways to put together a survey. So proper survey design has to have good question wording. And when it's not worded well, you have a large measurement error because questions can be worded to be skewed for an answer to try and lead people in one direction. And they really don't need to be like that. They need to be worded very precisely so the survey results are more reliable. So poor question wording, faulty ordering of questions, like if it's not in a good progress for what they're discussing, it jumps all over the place. Ambiguous words, like kind of large meanings can be incorporated by it. Awkward questions like that aren't worded well, so then people don't completely understand them, and so then they can answer them wrong. And then questions built with built-in biases. All of those things. And so I'm in the minority because I do this for a living. If I get somebody calling me with a polling question or questions, I take the time to answer them. I don't hang up, I'm not rude, because they're just doing their job. And all of these things help move our political process along. So I very much believe in them. So I will sit there and take the time to answer all the questions and give all of my opinions. And I actually had somebody one time call me with such a terrible survey. Like the questions were skewed, things were not worded well. And I actually told them, whoever created this survey ought to be fired because this is awful. And I was explaining why it was awful. And you could tell it was like a volunteer, a very low paid person. They were like, I had no idea. And I was like, yeah, I know. Like, you probably don't have a political science degree. You're just doing the job or whatever, but yeah, the survey sucks. So that's something to always keep in mind, like if you do come across surveys, if somebody calls you. So more and more people are getting away from phone surveys to online and going to online surveys because people don't have home numbers anymore, right? So if most everybody's got a cell phone, less and less people are having home phones. So it's harder to reach people with that random digit dialing, and you can screen easier than you used to. It's like, I don't know that number. Oh, it says spam. Well, then I guess I better not answer it, right? It also costs a lot less money because they're not having to hire a bunch of people to be on the phone making calls. They can just send out mass emails. They can do it through social media. There's all kinds of ways that would save a lot more money, and it's quicker, right? So I'm on a lot of email and text message lists, like for different things that I care about, that I'm passionate about, things that line up with my political values and beliefs, with my political party preferences, with candidates I'm interested in, all that stuff. And I don't always do it because I don't always have time, but I try to make time. If they happen to send something and they have a survey and they want to know how you feel about issues, I take the 30 seconds or whatever to answer it, because I know that it helps push along the agenda that I care about, because it's going into those stats for them to say, hey, we, like, a majority of people said that they really cared about this issue. Like, we need to make this a priority. So, so a lot of surveys are what they call hybrid surveys, where they might do like an initial call to like see if you like fit the criteria for the survey, and then they might send like follow-ups online, or vice versa. I've actually had people call me based on my online survey results too. So it just depends. I wonder if they still have the example here. Okay, not quite. So I'm going to talk about something in just a second. From another book that I have. It's the example is not in your book, but it's a really good example of polls and when they go wrong. So, so that's survey design and online surveys. And then on page 174, it talks about social desirability effects. So that's the effect that results when respondents in a survey report what they expect the interviewer wishes to hear rather than what they believe. So a lot of people try and interpret what the survey is about, and then they just want to be agreeable. Some people hide their preferences because they don't want social retribution. They don't know how anonymous these things are. If they're conservative in a liberal area or liberal in a conservative area, they don't want bad pushback, right? Like I got a call one time and I was clearly not the target audience because my views were like completely opposite of what they thought they were going to get based on like my address and where I lived and whatever. And I was like, I don't even know how I got on this list, but you guys, like, this is going to mess up your numbers. Like, I'm my answer, but you're not going to like it. And they were like, that is weird. I don't really know how you got on this list, because like clearly they'd been hearing a certain type of response all day, and then mine was like completely opposite of that. So I like to mess with people. I got nothing but time, baby. So but a lot of people are afraid to give their true opinions. There's also something called the bandwagon effect, which we'll talk about in just a second, that can negatively impact it. So that's one of the negative things that happens if a survey is not designed correctly. The next thing that it talks about is selection bias. So it's a polling error that arises when the sample is not representative of the population being studied, which creates errors in overrepresenting or underrepresenting some opinions. Like when I was talking about the Medicare thing, right? Like if there's something specific to Medicare That would be like immediate, like not a down the road thing where somebody in 20 years is going to affect it, but people who are on it now, disability, seniors, like, and you go and question, like you're calling an 18-year-old or you're sending an 18-year-old, they don't know nothing about no Medicare, right? Like that's not something that they're focused on unless they happen to be an outlier and either they're already disabled or they have a family member or somebody that they're dealing with who has Medicare. But on average, they're not going to know anything about it. So, so that can create a selection bias as well if the sample is wrong, if they don't get the right sample. So, this says, though public opinion is important, it is not always easy to interpret, and polls often fail to predict how Americans will vote. In 1948, election night polls showed that Thomas Dewey defeated Harry S. Truman for presidency, which caused the Chicago Daily Tribune to print a banner incorrectly announcing Dewey's win. Oops. In 2016, most polls showed Hillary Clinton leading Donald Trump, causing many to doubt the possibility of Trump winning the election. The negative side to that too, especially with 24-hour news cycles and social media, if stuff gets called too early, people stop going to the polls because they're like, it's already been called. Why am I bothering? Like clearly the numbers, like, doesn't matter how I go and vote now because it's already been decided, which isn't really true. Like what happens in some of those calls that you hear is based on the numbers that are currently rolling in, but the average person doesn't pay attention to that. And so then they think, oh, well, it's over. When like I worked an election one time when I was working at the elections office. It was a city race. There's a city commission seat, and you know, a city race is much tighter, less people voting, numbers are smaller. A lot of times it's a much tighter race because everybody knows everybody in their community. So it ended up being a 1 vote difference. So then, or was it school board? I don't remember now. Anyways, we had to do a recount where we ran everything back through the machines. And because it was that close, we had to do a manual recount. Okay, candidate A got a vote, goes in this box. Candidate B got a vote, goes in this box, and then count, and then put them back through the machines again to see if it worked. When it was all said and done, the same person won, but by like 2 votes. And that could have been human error too. Like it still could have been the 1 vote. But what if 5 of the other person's folks would have come out? Right? So, so that's why it's important to like go, like, and if you're going to vote and the polls are closing at 7 and there's a line around the block, but you're in that line, you are allowed to vote by law. And usually what they do is they send like one of the poll workers from the precinct to like sit at the end of the line or stand at the end of the line. So nobody else can like get in line at like 7:01 or something. But if you're in line at 7 o'clock and the polls close, you still get to vote because it's not your fault that everybody wanted to vote and everybody's at that precinct, right? So so that's important to know, like don't turn around because the line is long or whatever. And poll workers are trained, I mean, I can't speak for every state, but I can speak for Bay County. Like they're very efficient, you're in and out, there's not a long wait, regardless of how busy something is. So it's important to make sure that your voice is heard, like stick it out, you know, like make sure that you get your vote in. So here are some other things that happen when you're measuring public opinion. So there's something called push polling, which is a polling technique in which the questions are designed to shape the respondent's opinion. So it's not really meant to find out what public opinion is so much as they want favorable numbers to put out for their particular issue that they're polling about or their candidate or whatever. And so they word it in a way where they can get you to kind of agree with them to get favorable results. That is not a properly designed poll, but it happens. And then there's the bandwagon effect that I mentioned before. So the definition of bandwagon effect is a shift in electoral support to the candidate with whom public opinion polls report as the front runner. So that's, you hear on the media like, well, new polls are coming out saying that this person is leading the charge and this person has this much turnout so far. And based on polling done of people standing in line to vote, like this was the number of people, or and so a lot of people will jump on that bandwagon of everybody else is voting for them. And I wasn't really sure. So I guess I'll vote for them too, because the majority of people seem to like them. So they must be okay. Or, you know, like, well, I saw more t-shirts and more signs and more bumper stickers and whatever for this particular person. So more people must be supporting them. So I'm going to jump on that bandwagon and support them as well, because they didn't bother to do their homework. So that's the bandwagon effect. And that can skew polls as well, where I'm going to vote for so-and-so because my mom did. And they say that they're the best and I trust my mom. That's not a good reason to do it, right? So those are also things that can negatively impact public opinion. So before we get into the public opinion questions, remember on page 176 is the like, what do you think? Real world example stuff. Feel free to check that. That's pretty awesome. Studying for this, obviously I'll put out a study guide sometime next week, because the exam for this will be on chapters 6, 7, 8, and 9. So you're doing 6 and 7 this week, 8 and 9 next week. So probably over the holiday weekend, I'll go ahead and make the study guide. So you guys have like all of next week with it. I think I actually might already have it ready. I just have to review it. So review the study guide, review the lectures, do the practice quizzes at the end of the chapters. This one is on page 177 to 179. Look at the key terms, look at those questions. You will literally see some of the exact same questions again on the exam. I know I've mentioned that in other lectures. So for the, 5 of you or however many actually take the time to watch lectures, these questions, I don't use necessarily every single one, but you will see some of these again. You'll see them on the quiz, and then you'll see them again on the exam. Like you will see that repeated. So it does you good to take time to do these practice quizzes. And it also serves as another means of studying. Okay, I just finished reading the book, the chapter, I just finished listening to that lecture. Let me take the practice quiz, see how well I did. See what I understand off the top of my head. Oh, I don't remember what that is. Let me thumb back through the chapter and find the answer. And then I can do that. And the practice quizzes give you the page number that you'll find the answer on. So like question 1, the term public opinion is used to describe what? And it says it's found on page 151. So if you don't remember, page 151. I know some people will even like type these up and then they'll put the answers and they'll use that as part of their study guide, and they'll add it to the study guide that I give. For people who are like overachievers and like really need a lot of different means of studying, that's a really good option for you. So definitely take advantage of the fact that there's a practice quiz. Now, before I get into the public opinion, I'm going to grab the old book for public opinion because I want to be able to go over an example of the polls. See if I can find it. I hate that they took it out because it was really great. So, so when we're talking about skewing a poll, they had an example, like an actual example of one that was done. So this was in 2000. So it says the public's desire for tax cuts can be hard to measure. In 2000, pollsters asked what should be done with the nation's budget surplus and got different results depending on the specifics of the question. So here's the question and then 2 variations on what they want an answer to. President Clinton has proposed setting aside approximately 2/3 of an expected budget surplus to fix the Social Security system. What do you think the leaders in Washington should do with the remainder of the surplus? Variation 1 says, should the money be used for a tax cut or should it be used to fund new government programs? How do you think people answered? Tax cut by 60%. 25% said new programs, 11% said other purposes, 4% said don't know. Second variation of that question. Should the money be used for a tax cut or should it be spent on programs for education, the environment, healthcare, crime fighting, and military defense? 22% said tax cut, 69% said programs, 6% said other, and 3% said don't know. When they were told specifically what those government programs were, and they also left out government, it just said should be spent on programs for, where the first question said government programs. People shut down on that, like, no, man, give me my money. I want the tax cut. But when they found out, well, here's what the surplus is going to go to, oh yeah, those things are important. Let's do that instead. Like, I'd rather that than the tax cut. So it all depends on how questions are worded as to the way people tend to answer. So they answered pretty much the exact opposite because the question was worded differently. So really, really hate that they don't have it anymore, but see if I can put it up where you can see it clearly enough. Let's see. Hopefully you're able to see that. You can pause the video and look at it. Hopefully, did I do that right? Make sure that you can see all of it. I think I did it too close. Here you go. So you can pause that and like zoom it in and look at it if that's something that you're interested in. So now we're going to do the public opinion poll. Question number 1, do you agree or disagree that American policy and laws reflect the preferences and opinions of most American people most of the time? A, strongly agree. They do reflect America's preferences and opinions. B, agree. C, disagree. D, strongly disagree. They do not reflect America's preferences and opinions. Now, this is a personal thing. For most people, they would say it depends on who's in office. It depends on who's in charge at the time. And of course, for a lot of people, that is also subjective, right? Like, liberals might think, well, if Democrats are in office, maybe they're listening better than when conservatives are in office. If conservatives are answering, they might feel like conservatives will do better as listening. So this is very, very subjective to your own personal values and beliefs. And really, it's kind of a toss-up, right? Like, it depends on the issue. It depends on, what group of American people are you talking about? We're such a plethora of differences and different sort of people that, I think it's difficult to say, like what the American people always want. It just depends. Question number 2, do you think people rely primarily on their feelings or specific facts when determining their own personal positions on issues and candidate preferences? A, mostly feelings. B, mostly facts. I wish there was like a C, a mixture of both, because I really feel that that's probably more accurate. Like, people's personal experiences skew how they feel about things. That's feelings. And then they might take their already like kind of preconceived notions and then look at the rest of the evidence. But what weighs heavier, like your personal feelings based on your life experiences or facts on an issue? And I think that depends on the person, right? Like, who goes more with their gut and the way they feel about something or the logic side? Like, I think that varies from person to person. Question number 3. Some political leaders are most concerned with public opinion, while some lean more heavily on their own judgment than on popular sentiment. What do you believe is more appropriate in a democracy? A, political leaders should be most concerned with public opinion and should govern according to mass policy preferences. Or B, political leaders should be less concerned with public opinion and should govern based on their judgment. So a good example of this is the Roe v. Wade thing, right? Like, Supreme Court did B because they don't have to worry about losing their jobs. But the majority of people that have been polled for their public opinion disagreed with that choice. So if they had been following along with that, they would have chosen A. And it really is kind of a case-by-case situation, because To a certain extent, you're putting trust in elected officials to make the best decision with all of the evidence that they have, all the information they have on what's going on behind the scenes, plus what people at home want. And it's kind of a catch-22, right? Like they want to do what's right based on the information they have, but they also want to do what's going to keep them their jobs. And sometimes that's back and forth. And it's their job to kind of report and stay in the spotlight to say, listen, here's what we're seeing of what they're allowed to, right? Some things are matters of security that you can't talk about, but what they can, they should be communicating to the public to say, this is why I want to vote this way. Here's how this will positively impact. This is why, like, you guys should care about this. This is how some people feel. I understand that some people feel like this, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of communication gets broken down where people don't feel like they're being informed. And so then they feel like shady stuff is being done. So it kind of depends on the situation as to how they vote. It's usually not like as black and white as just A or just B. Number 4, which of the following do you think has had the greatest influence on your own political values? A, family. B, social groups, racial, religious, national. C, education. D, political conditions and experiences. Obviously, that's subjective of your own experiences, right? For me, I have always been pretty like stubborn about like, if like I get down and dirty about like, this matters to me, I care about this, I don't really care what you think. Not that I don't care, but like, you're not like, if it's something I'm really passionate about, like, that's great that you don't agree with me, but that's not going to change my mind. For me personally, like education and political conditions and experiences are the 2 things that influence me the most for my political values. And then family and social groups are way down low on the totem pole. Probably a little bit of family more than social groups. And that's only because for me, family and political conditions kind of go hand in hand with my dad's story that I told you guys about in the first lecture. So a little bit of A and D kind of go together, but not in everything. So, but for other people, like that might not be the case at all. So it really is very subjective. Number 5, thinking about your 2 closest friends, would you say your views on political topics are very similar, similar on some topics and different on others, very different? Depends on if you're very much opposites attract with your closest friends, right? Like I have a handful of people who I would consider like my closest friends, and one of them, like, we are like 2 peas in a pod on most issues. One on a lot of issues, not on all issues. And then one, it's varies very a lot of it, and that's because they don't really take the time to be very knowledgeable about it. So then they kind of shut down because they get stressed about it. I mean, we started. I think, again, this varies on how engaged you are and how engaged the other people are, right? So I don't really have friends too much that are polar opposites. And if I do, it's because we've just known each other for a really long time and we just don't talk politics. So, but of course, again, that is going to vary from person to person. So, and this, of course, is in your book, Confidence in Democratic Institutions. So percentage of the population who have a great deal or quite a lot of confidence in. The light orange is the press, the dark orange is political parties, and green is parliament. So people actually have much more faith in the press than they do of the others. And we'll talk about that more when we talk about the media. Now, this lovely little insert in your book is fantastic. I absolutely love these, the how to. So on page 172 and 173, this is how to evaluate a poll and how well they did. So question number 1 is, who did they interview? 2 is, how did they interview their subjects? 3, how many people did they interview? 4, what confidence do we have in the results? 5, over what length of time? Like, when did they how quickly did they poll? Because if you wait too long on some of the polls, like maybe something happens in the world that would shift people's opinions. Number 6, what survey mode was used? So like a live phone call, automated call, internet, et cetera, et cetera. 7, in what order were questions asked and with what wording? Number 8, who conducted the poll? And so this is a really great little read for you guys to show how effective a survey is based on what's ticked off in the little check marks, like how much of that they do well. So hopefully this has helped you guys kind of understand better about maybe your own political values and beliefs, kind of maybe where you get some of your feelings on things at. And if you didn't have a lot of opinions, maybe this will help start you down the path to figuring out who you are as far as like political beliefs and sort of where all of that comes from. And hopefully like how they design a poll helps, because a lot of people go, I don't understand. They said they, like, how do they get these numbers? Like, how do they have these stats or whatever? So hopefully like the polls help you understand that. And then if you hear of anybody saying, I just don't understand where they get these numbers from, you know, now you can sort of school them on it and say, well, actually, like, it's kind of a big process. So, so hopefully this chapter has helped and been informative. I am so sorry that it is spread out over 3 parts. But yay, 3rd time's the charm. The first 2 are like, one's like 21 minutes, one was like 26 minutes, and then I don't even know how long this one is. It doesn't give me like a time until I stop it, so I don't even know. So sorry if it ran long, like I got all disheveled with the stop and go. So, but hopefully this helps with you guys. I will post all 3 together and labeled as part 1, part 2, part 3. So that way it makes sense when you're watching it. So you're not starting out with like 2 and going, did I miss something? So as always, let me know if you have any questions. If you have any problems, remember, as always, the quiz is due by 11:59 p.m. Central Standard Time on Sunday, the day before the 4th of July. The campus is closed on the actual 4th, which is on Monday, but the rest of the week is not the case. So anything that's assigned next week, even though we have like 1 day holiday, it's still all due next Sunday. So take it as you will if you want to take the weekend and not do anything, or if you feel like, hey, that gives me a little extra time because I'm not working or whatever. Obviously time management is completely up to you. So let me know if you have any questions or if you need anything, and we will be discussing the media chapter next. All right. Thanks, guys.